and get started. I know some other folks will probably come in. I know some folks have classes and other engagements later on. So obviously feel free to get up and leave. My name is Peter Groff. I am a visiting fellow here at Johns Hopkins. And one of the things that I was tasked to work on was create a lecture series on the issue and the subject of charters. And Vice Dean Holcomb McCoy asked me to put this together, so I certainly want to recognize her and thank her for her support. This is the second of a series that we're going to have through the end of, or towards the beginning of May. Next month, we will have a discussion on the legal issues facing charter schools across the country. Renita Tukral, who is the Senior Director of Legal Affairs at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, will be in and talk about those issues. In April, that'll be March 6th. On April 10th, Todd Zebarth, who is the Vice President of State Advocacy and Support for the Alliance, will be here to talk about policy issues and kind of what's happening across the country. Todd, in my opinion, I worked with him at the Alliance, is probably the foremost expert on charter schools and charter school policy in the country. So we were glad to be able to get him. He's based in Milwaukee, so we were able to get him to come out. And then on May 8th, we will have a conversation with Jason Botel, who is the school leader at KIPP Baltimore, about the issue of human capital and some of those issues facing the charter sector. But today we have Makisha Boothe here to talk about the issue of diversity. Makisha currently is in Denver, and she's working with Denver Public Schools as the
Director of Leadership Development.
Director of
Autonomous
Leadership Development. Autonomous Leadership Development. Makisha was with me at the National Alliance when I was head of that organization and headed up our diversity and inclusion work. Before that, we also worked together when I was president of the Colorado Senate. She was the deputy policy director for me and a senior advisor. In that role, I was able to snatch her. She was a small business owner in Denver, an award-winning small business owner in Denver, but really had an interest in politics and policy, and we were able to get her to come over to the dark side and work with us with regard to policy, and she has not left yet, so apparently it was the right decision to make. She is from New York City, from Harlem, the mother of a very precocious 11-year-old who is one of my son's best friends. Really an outstanding young leader in terms of policy and thought leadership on the issue of diversity and autonomous schools, and so I was glad to be able to have her come back out. She just left the Alliance a couple of months ago to return to Denver to work for Denver Public Schools, but has agreed to come here and talk about diversity today. So Makisha Boothe.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Thank you to Peter for inviting me out. We've worked together for several years. I definitely view him as a mentor and a friend. I don't know that he admits that I'm like a friend. He's not like the huggy friend kind, but I can tell that we're kind of like friends now. And so I appreciate you inviting me out. Thank you to the Vice Dean, and just thank you to the university for having me. I am guessing that I'm here because Peter wanted me to share with you some of my experiences on the ground nationally, on the ground in Colorado, doing school turnaround work, doing autonomous school work, and working with charter schools and doing charter school advocacy across the country. And in all of those roles, I had quite the experience and lessons and challenges in diversity. And so I thought I'd just share a little bit about that with you today. So today I'm just going to do a quick overview of some, before I kind of get into the meat of my experiences, I'm going to talk a little bit about major issues, facts, major players in diversity, and some of the strategies that we used and felt needed to be used as we wrapped up our work at the Alliance and as we move forward, even in the work that I'm doing in Colorado around diversity. So I just started at DPS, and I find that DPS is probably one of the worst places for acronyms. Everything everyone says is an acronym, and I'm so confused. So I thought I would be cognizant of that in the charter world and kind of lay out a couple of words that we throw around often and maybe give you the definitions behind how we're using them before we get started. One, in terms of charter schools, we're referring to public charter schools, and the definition for those as used by the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is that they are independent public schools that are allowed the freedom to be more innovative while being held accountable for improved student achievement. In terms of a charter management organization, they're nonprofit entities that manage 2 or more charter schools, and they often provide like back office functions such as hiring, professional development, training, operations, that sort of thing. An EMO is pretty much the same thing, but it's a for-profit entity. Charter support organizations, or CSOs, are what we call the organizations that are charter school leagues or offices that support charter schools and perform charter school advocacy, legislative advocacy, training, that sort of thing on the state level, so in each state or in the states that have them and have charter laws. And then in terms of authorizers, it's basically an entity that's responsible for granting charters to charter schools and allowing them to develop and operate and provide oversight for the charter school. So I wanted to go through just really quickly, how many of you were in Peter's last overview? Okay, so there'll be just a little bit of repeat here in the beginning, just so that folks who weren't here can get some of the basic background information and facts and stats, but wanted to go through that really quick. So there's 5,200 charter schools with 2 million students nationally. About 400 to 500 new charters open each year. About 150 to 200,000 new students enroll in charters each year, and they have more than 400 and actually it's closer to like 450 now, 450,000 students on waiting lists for charter schools across the country. This is relevant in terms of diversity because the charter movement is growing and diversity statistics are growing as well. There's about 63% of your charter school students that are non-white, compared with 43% in traditional schools. You have 52% of your charter school students that qualify for free and reduced lunch. So in terms of economic diversity, it's a little bit higher in that regard than traditional public schools. And then in terms of students who are limited English proficient, you have 17% in charters versus 11% in non-charters. Special education, the numbers are about the same, with about 12% of your students in charters needing an individualized education plan, an IEP. In terms of your teachers, so you have, if you look at public charter schools, you have about 12% of your teachers that are African American, 11% that are Hispanic, and 72% that are white. If you look at your traditional public schools, you have about almost 7% that are African American, about almost 8% that are Hispanic, and 83% that are white. This is actually not the perception that's out there, but these are the numbers. In terms of school leadership, about 19% of your principals in charter schools are Black, and about 10% in traditional schools are African American. In terms of Hispanic principals and school leaders, you have 8.8% that are Hispanic, and then as you can see here, you have a lower number, 5.7% in traditional public schools. And so this is actually something statistics that aren't often talked about, but the numbers in terms of teachers and school leaders of color are higher in charter schools. They still have work to do. They still don't look the same, particularly since they have a higher number of students of color. They're not reflective the way that they should be, but the numbers are a little bit higher. So in terms of the mainstream efforts that you would plug a diversity initiative into, or plan or strategy into, the main areas that most organizations that are advocating for charter schools encompass growth, quality, and sustainability. So really looking at how can we grow charter schools, grow high-performing and quality charter schools, and then sustain that movement so that those schools are succeeding and that they're sticking around, and that they're also cross-pollinating their ideas with traditional schools and serving as models for other schools in the country. Two kind of major areas in those areas of focus are advocacy and development. So some organizations focus on advocating for charter schools, some focus on really school development and recruiting leaders and training leaders and growing schools, and some do a little bit of both. And so where diversity comes in for that work that's being done mainstream is that often when advocates are seeking out support for charter school laws, charter growth, charter quality, that support is impacted by communities of color, because you often see that African American leaders, communities, are the students, are the teachers, are the leaders that have to make votes around these issues, and their support impacts the growth or lack thereof. In terms of the connection to the school community, it's really important that diversity initiatives are put in place so that these communities are engaged and informed and participating and informing the process, as well as being informed about the process that it takes to develop great charter policy and to develop great charter schools that impact their children and their communities. So that connection to them is really important, that interaction with them is really important, and it impacts the quality of the school. Inclusivity impacts sustainability past reform trends. In other words, once this is not the trendiest discussion on the block, charter schools will still be here. They will still be in existence. African American and Hispanic kids will still be in them. And the teachers and leaders that are most dedicated, committed, and stem from those communities will need to be trained to sustain that movement. And so some of the opportunities that mainstream advocates and organizations look at often as, they engage in their work and looking at how diversity impacts that is the opportunity to develop an advocacy base through African American and Hispanic communities as they begin to hit legislatures and change state laws, as they begin to hit the Capitol and look at federal policies, they begin to promote on the local level school development. It's really an opportunity to engage these communities and build a stronger support base for the work that they're trying to do. Also, you know that a lot of African American communities are largely Democratic. A lot of African American legislators and elected officials are largely Democratic. And this is an opportunity to build a bipartisan effort, because it's not a typical effort that you look at, that you're viewing when you look at charter schools. Legislators often have a lot of party line issues, and charter schools, the benefits of charter schools, the challenges of charter schools, and the policy behind it really do impact in a positive manner people and their bases on both sides of the aisle. And so it's really an opportunity to build bipartisan effort by first working through Black and Hispanic caucuses to build support. So the mainstream movement around charter schools has viewed that as one way to increase support and build a bipartisan effort that will move charter schools forward. And then finally, a pipeline of diverse messengers and leaders is needed for this movement. It cannot be one voice or one group, because charter schools, by nature of what they are so different and bring so many different opportunities to the table. The concept of a charter school is that it is a school that will perform differently. It will be released from all of the structures that allow, so that it can be different, it can be innovative. And so they don't all look the same. You have some that focus on special ed, you have some that focus on gifted and talented, you have some that focus on urban areas, some in rural areas, and some on STEM, some on there's many different themes. And so that said, you really need a diverse pipeline of leaders and messengers to really educate the populations in which these schools are setting up about what charter schools are and how they work and how they can be of a benefit to the community, because people often want to sign up for one team or another. I've been a Democrat forever. This is what I know. Republicans have never done anything nice for me. This is where I go, and I just kind of vote down the ticket this way. So as soon as you tell me that these folks are behind charter schools and I've never worked with them, it's really hard for me to understand. The messenger, however, can change that perspective. If you bring someone who I trust to me to tell me that this is really something different, take a look at it, step out the box, open your mind, and look at this from a different perspective, I might open up and begin to explore the issue and see if it's something that I can work with. So in doing the work across the country in terms of diversity and charter schools, we found a few things that needed to be done that weren't being done to the fullest. One, increase supportive action in communities of color. Increase supportive action among legislators and elected officials and leaders of color. Increasing that pipeline of diverse leaders and messengers. Strengthening partnerships within the sector is huge. There are a number of different organizations that are dedicated to looking at diversity issues in the sector, and they're not really all aligned. And so really looking at collective work, collective impact, collaboration, and partnerships is really something that has yet to be done really effectively and needs to be done. And then increasing awareness among funders about why diversity is important. Often funders have a goal in mind and they want to get there, and the work that needs to be done to lay the groundwork to get that work done, for it to be effective and sustainable, isn't always right in front of them and isn't always presented and, and talked about and given to them in a real kind of honest way. I can do this, but first you have to understand how this work impacts it, and so you need to invest resources over here in this work if you want to get here. And so that conversation doesn't have to happen often with funders, and they're very kind of laser focused on where they want to put their dollars, and diversity is not on the top of the list. That presents other problems that I'll kind of talk about later. In terms of the challenges associated with the charge that I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, there are a number of them. One, about 68% of the general public isn't even aware of what a public charter school actually is. They have misinformation, they are miseducated about what it is, and some of that's intentional through opposition, and some of that is just simply lack of awareness. There's a lot of myth busting to do. There is the perception that charter schools actually resegregate schools, when often those charter schools are actually in a neighborhood where there is segregation. So the traditional school down the street looks the same exact way in terms of demographics. Special education and enrollment are huge issues in communities of color, because we have historically in Black and Hispanic communities dealt with lack of access to quality schools, and the game that is played when you want to get your child in a great school is, it's a rough one. And so when they start looking at charter schools, not knowing what they are, they wonder, are you setting this up and will I have access? When I get in, will you be routing me into special education as you often misidentify and do? And if so, then that's a problem, because special education, there's a lot of myths around that in terms of charters even being able to serve those students. And so these types of issues often came up when I was in legislatures, when I would visit with civil rights leaders, when I would visit with parents, and often, there was a huge fear around exactly how charter schools would impact the communities, the kids, the leaders. They often view the charter school movement as white and conservative led. There is some truth in that. There is a need to build a pipeline of leadership. And again, this goes back to funders and mainstream organizations really recognizing that need and addressing it. But there's also, again, a growing and evolving perspective around charter schools on behalf of people of color, on behalf of Democrats and other parties. And so it's a constantly evolving movement. And so this is not entirely true, and folks are, because it's such a new issue, but it is an issue, a perception with some truth in it. Trust and historical race issues. I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings on the national level and on the state level with leaders of the Urban League, the NAACP, NCLR, and different 100 Black Men and Pan-Hellenic organizations, local civil rights organizations in different cities and states, and this is viewed as being tied to a lot of the historical race issues in education, particularly in the South, which was where I was focused on the Southern strategy. It's viewed as something that's totally tied to massive resistance. And so when you sit down, the minds, the hearts are closed, and folks are on guard because they see charter schools as just a repeat of history where they were shut out from the public education system, and there was a system that was put in its place to do just that. And so you have to kind of talk through sort of current charter day law, what a current public charter school is, and you have to send, again, I can't stress the importance of sending the right messenger to talk to folks. Peter was great with that because Peter was a former Senate president who led a Democratic caucus. And so often folks understood, okay, well, you get what our agenda is, you get what our community needs, and you're saying that we should take a look at charter schools. And so that was definitely a great help in reaching some of our civil rights leaders. Territorialism around this work is just a very real fact. Because funders do not fund this work to the degree that it needs to be funded, the few people who want to do this work often find themselves really, pushing each other out, fighting, competing for funds to do the work, and it creates a little bit of a chaos. So people are working around that now to try to bring folks together. And then special interests and party line pressure. Sitting in offices with African American and Hispanic legislators who say, I believe charter schools work, I've seen what you're talking about. I know that what you're saying is true, but I cannot place that vote because my Black caucus will isolate me. And I'm already isolated from the mainstream caucus. So now you want me to give up my African American and my Hispanic legislative friends and make sure that no bill I ever put through passes and that I'm never reelected. Those pressures are real. And in addition to that sort of political pressure, there's the thought that, okay, so if this is the right thing, I have 10 other right things that I'm trying to do too. I have 10 other bills here too that I'm trying to pass. And so do I sacrifice the rest of my agenda for this piece? And so they're struggling internally with how to position themselves to be able to support this issue if they're even willing to step out at all. There was a delegate in Virginia that I spoke with who ran the bill for the charter bill a couple of years back, and she said to me, I will never, ever get out on front of this again. I'm still paying for it to this day, and it was like 2 years later. And so she was really clear that I agree, I put myself out there, and I haven't been able to get anything done since. And so there's that reality as well. Failing schools, special education, and enrollment are here again because while there's perception up here, there's also some truth, as I said before. There are failing schools out there, charter schools that aren't working. There are traditional schools that aren't working, and there's heavy school turnaround efforts going in those various areas where you're trying to reach out to those same communities. And so it's really hard to talk to folks because they're tumultuous environments already through school turnaround efforts. They don't know where they're going to end up when the musical chairs stop, if everybody's going to have a seat. And so they're not really sure how to take charter schools and where that's going to put them. And it makes the conversation even much more difficult. Special education, there have been some challenges with charter schools, accessing funding for special education and other resources for special education, complying with special education laws, or the laws not even being clear and concise around what they need to do in terms of special education. And so a lot of schools struggle with providing those services to students for those many reasons and more. And so when you have those sorts of things at play, trying to draw support, trying to actually grow the movement, improve the quality of the movement makes it just that much harder, and trying to create diverse support around it, particularly when we know that a larger number of African Americans and Hispanics are in special education programs, it makes it hard. Enrollment as well, the same issue. You have not a lot actually, but you do have instances in every system where things aren't done correctly. And in the charter school system, you have some enrollment issues that have happened, and they're quick to be spotlighted in the media where there has been lack of access for some students, and some schools really just don't know the law. They're not well informed about exactly what a quality enrollment process looks like. So every now and then that happens, and it's reflected in some of the things you see in the media. So when you look at that piece as well, it's very hard to sit in front of a group and build their support when they come with questions like this, because you have to be honest about the fact that the movement is new, there are mistakes that are made, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and there are some great things that you can do with charter schools. And so I just wanted to kind of go through sort of the stakeholders in the movement, particularly around diversity, because it's sort of the approach that I tend to use, the people approach, like who's involved and what do you need from them, and what is their agenda, and what are their concerns, and what are the challenges that they bring, or that interacting with them brings. And in diversity, the civil rights organizations are targeted for support, advocacy. Faith-based leaders have been targeted for advocacy support, but also a lot for school development. They have facilities often, and they have a congregation, and they have a support base in the community to really build a strong charter school, and so often they're attracted to it, and often they're recruited for school development. Diversity choice advocates, so those are the groups like Black Alliance for Educational Options and HCREO and Partners for Developing Futures that have a mission of advocating for school choice or charter schools in school development, or funding these types of initiatives. Legislators and elected officials of color, we're often pursuing them. I was part of the Southern Strategy. The work I did was part of the Southern Strategy of the National Alliance. And so we were in Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, and Virginia. And in Mississippi and Alabama, you have two of the largest Black caucuses in the nation. And so their votes mean a lot. And when you look at like Virginia, you have about 18 Black legislators. Their votes will have an impact on any bill that passes through. Their support matters. And so really a lot of our advocacy work meant us going through NBCSL, National Black Council of State Legislators, working to help legislators who do want to champion the issue, work them through being isolated, as I spoke about earlier, providing them cover, providing them campaign support in case they lose some support from unions from backing this effort. School board members and local school officials are huge, building support there, because once you get a great state law passed, once you get federal funding for it, you still have to get it authorized often through the school board level. And so working with school board members and local school district officials is huge, and you often see that a large number, they have a higher percentage of people of color working in those school districts. And so it matters. Perception on the local level definitely matters. Mainstream charter advocates like the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, the Charter School Growth Fund, the National NACSAs, the National Authorizing Organization, and then your state CSOs, your CMOs, so all of your mainstream charter advocates and workers, working with them to understand that their plans, their agenda, their messaging really does impact the ability to build support in communities of color, that they should be intentional about weaving in diversity strategy in their entire effort. And that is something that's not being done across the board, and so those are conversations that are happening now. Think tanks, so you know that there's a ton of research out there about charter schools, and they land all over the place in terms of their findings, and so they impact the work that you do as well. As soon as a media article comes out and touts the latest finding about charter schools, you never know which end it's going to end up on, and it will impact you when you go into a room with a legislator or a parent or a community leader. They want to know why this report says that charter schools really don't work. They're not closing the achievement gap, or they heard that it does, and so they want to learn more about it. And so think tanks do have an impact on diversity work. And then in terms of funders, we talked about that earlier, looking at funders who are supporting mostly legislative advocacy, some grassroots organizing. They're not really looking at micro-targeting their messaging or their work for communities of color. They're not really funding leadership development, building a pipeline of diverse leaders. They're not interested in funding that as much, seeing very little of that. And then huge is that they don't often want to fund small independent operators, and even on the federal level, policy is not really geared around small independent operators. About 77% of your charter schools are run by small independent operators. This is really important because a lot of them are leaders of color. You don't have a lot of leaders at the CMO level that are people of color. And so they have a hard time accessing federal funding because they usually don't even have the infrastructure, the tools, and the resources to apply for the funding. I had a meeting with NCLR. It was about 30 Hispanic school leaders, and the first thing they asked us was, when are you going to provide some support for us to be able to access federal funding, to just apply for it, like some support around that, because it's an incredible process, or when are you going to provide other avenues of support and resources for us, funding for us? That was a huge question that I had no answer for. Like, it's definitely something that's lacking in the policy world, in the political world. And the other thing is that I don't think that it's exclusive to the charter world. I think big business replication is just an attractive thing right now, and so folks are scared to branch out and engage in small business type work, even though they are the bulk of the operators in the nation. So I want to go through this really quick. Civil rights organizations. I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview of my experience with where these organizations are. So I told you what NCLR's main concern was. When we visited with them, their focus is mostly on school development. They have about 30 school leaders nationally, and they are working to train and develop those leaders and work in those communities to build support around those schools, those Hispanic-led charter schools. UNCF, United Negro College Fund, is starting to step out more into charter advocacy in their agenda. I don't even know that they've released that yet. but they're definitely looking more heavily at supporting school choice and a more robust education agenda. 100 Black Men, the same way, sort of looking at the opportunity to develop and start schools and do some advocacy work, mobilize their chapters around charter school development in addition to other ed reform issues. They're branching out and doing that sort of thing. UL Urban League is still developing their perspective, I think. We've met with their national leaders, we've met with their state leaders. While their national leadership is not really taking a supportive stand, they're not really heavily opposing it publicly yet. Behind the scenes, they're talking about ways to engage on this issue, and they haven't come out publicly yet. They're good friends with NAACP, who are heavy opposition on the national level, and so they don't really want to come out yet and say exactly what they're doing yet in hopes of not threatening that friendship. And NAACP is the opposite on the national level. Now, on the state level, their chapters are all over the place, particularly in the Urban League. You go into Denver, you go into Florida, you go into areas up north, and you'll see Urban League chapters that are really heavily engaged in charter school advocacy, or even operating schools. Like, you actually have a few Urban League charter schools. And so there's a huge disconnect between where national wants to go and where their state chapters need to go. And so often you'll find advocates shooting for building relationships at the state level around charter schools and charter school development and advocacy. With NAACP, it wasn't the case so much at first on that level. Like, you didn't see too many local chapters engaging in charter school advocacy. Definitely saw a lot of opposition on the state level. You definitely saw a lot of opposition on the national level. However, that's changing as well. There are about three NAACP state chapters that are applicants, charter school applicants right now in the country. And then in terms of faith-based leaders, you have your congregation-based advocacy work that we're trying to do on the state level. And Peter was kind of the first person to really start looking at, on the national level, how can we work with national faith-based organizations to create an agenda from the top that kind of trickles down, and you get, a bigger, more powerful bang that way. A lot of folks are looking at how we can move them into school operation. The issue with sort of the civil rights, the faith-based organizations, I call it like the gingerbread approach, because I think that people see a pastor, a set of parents, church, civil rights organization with a member base, and they say, and it's like candy, it's like delicious, it's like you want to consume them, you want them to become part of your movement, and you're going to go and you're going to eat the candy, but there's so many things you have to do before you can get that candy. They don't love you, they don't trust you, they don't respect you, they don't know who you are. Do not eat that candy until you get that taken care of. And so, and often they don't have the infrastructure to do the things you want them to do anyway. And there are so many people tapping into, or trying to tap into that, from different sectors, on different issues within the education reform world. You have people approaching faith-based leaders all the time saying, I know you have a congregation, I know that they trust you, I know that if you support this issue, you can lead them to support this issue, and this can be great for our movement. Well, they get that speech from a bunch of different people all the time. And so there's competing efforts, and they really need to be streamlined and packaged so that it's easy for them to support issues, because that's not their main job, and they are running churches and organizations, and they haven't mastered building infrastructures for advocacy work and school operation. And so those sorts of investments need to be made. The time needs to be taken to build relationships. The time needs to be taken to build an infrastructure, help them build an infrastructure that they can use later and that benefits them beyond just what you need. Let me make sure I got everything else in there. NBCSL was difficult. They definitely have, on their leadership level, some interest in charter schools. They've expressed some interest there, but they have a lot of Democratic legislators that are a part of their that are part of their membership base, and so they haven't often been out front about willing to look at the issue of charter schools in their conferences and bringing their legislators together. But I think that that's slowly evolving. You have some folks there, like I have a good friend there who's the policy director there, and she's telling me that those things are evolving, and they're starting to look at charter schools and where it could fit in a larger ed reform picture. But as of now, right now, we haven't done a ton of work with them. We started having, I think Peter started having some discussions with them as well, and so we're not sure where they'll land, but they're pulling together things that have nothing to do in charter schools in terms of organizing themselves, which is often the case in many of these organizations. They have a ton of work to do regardless of whether they take on charter schools or not, and it impacts their ability to support this issue. CBC and CHC. So we haven't done a ton of work with CHC, but with CBC, we've met with, I think you met with like 6 or 7 CBC members, right? And we found that there wasn't a ton of heavy support there either. You had a couple of folks that are supporting. And so it was really, making sure that they understood the issue, because often before you could even get them to adopt the issue, you had to get them past the myths, get them past the inaccurate statistics, educate them on what charter schools are, how they work, and how strong charter schools laws and policies impact the ability for you to bring high-performing charters to your area, and then move into the political realm where you discuss political cover and that sort of thing. So I think that's everything on the stakeholders. Any questions so far? Okay.
There's a couple of points I'd like to
Yeah, sure.
So the issue about the statistics, I think, is a very interesting one because, and difficult, right? So a lot of it depends on what level we're talking about, right? So nationally, the statistics you showed, they're mirroring the traditional sector. But as we narrow down in and go to the city and look at the actual district it's in, it looks similar. But then we look at schools and we see large clumps of schools that are high minority, 100% African American. We see schools that are high majority white.
Yeah.
And the statistics, I think, get in the way. So we have these discussions at the policy level of, apartheid schools. People throw out these kinds of terms, resegregation. Right. On the other hand, we have some that say, oh, no, they're not. But if we dig down in and are honest, it opens up a very interesting set of questions about, how do parents find out about these schools? In a lot of cases, they do look like neighborhood schools because that's how schools find students. So to what extent are, at a national advocacy level, is there a willingness to really engage? Because those are the real questions.
It's very hard to get to the real questions. It's frustrating. I went into a legislator's office yesterday, and he wanted to play the statistics game. He wanted to dance around the issue. At the core, at the heart of the issue, are the schools working for the kids? When you get to a charter school and you are in that neighborhood, is that child going to graduate? Is that child prepared for higher ed? Is it working? That question is not where all the focus is often at. It's so hard to get folks there, and and I opened up the dialogue there. Here, let me show you some of the great things that I've seen across the country. Great things for white kids, for black kids, for Asian kids, different themes, different focuses, serving a variety of types of student populations. Charter schools are doing it, and they're doing it well, and we should replicate the ones who are. We should use some of the best practices when we can. We should allow new and innovative models to pop up when they do. Those sorts of conversations are hard to have because then you are met back with, well, I read this statistic, and I saw this research, and
So I guess part of my question is, one of the potential interesting abilities of charter schools is to break kind of the traditional, I live here, I go to this school, right? It's opening up choices for people that maybe traditionally don't. Mm-hmm. And I guess my concern is that too often we don't really talk about the fact that, how do parents find a school? Do they really have the whole choice? And then if they are mirroring the traditional sector, that needs to enter the discussion about diversity. Is that, as a society, is that what we want, just a replication, but maybe it's a better school? 1 or 2 choices versus an entire, you see where I'm going with that? So I think, sometimes I don't think we get down to that level of discussion.
in terms of enrollment specifically and access,
Yeah.
I think that conversation is happening, but I think that it's again, it's guided by a lot of distrust. Can we get into the school? How did you tell folks about the school? Those are huge issues, legal issues. Renita will be here next month, right, you said? And she will talk heavily about the huge debate going on the state level, on the federal level, in communities around access to charter schools. It's a big part of the charter application process, the enrollment plans and their outreach and recruitment plans. Even at DPS where I'm at now, enrollment is a huge piece of that process. How do you plan to communicate with community members about your school, letting them know what it does and that anyone can apply, it's tuition free, like those sorts of things. And then setting up enrollment processes, particularly like in diversity, one of the issues around enrollment is for English language learners and their families, looking at making the application process one that doesn't deter applicants from the Hispanic community. Yeah, those conversations are happening within the sector and then within the districts, because the districts are often met with complaints, and so they have to face those issues as well. I wouldn't say that they're widespread public issues on the statewide policy level at all, except for the fact that, obviously enrollment is a part of a charter school law. There's enrollment policies and components of a charter school bill. But on the lower level, yeah, those conversations are happening, and they're complex, and it's a difficult conversation to have in many communities. But that's one of the reasons why charter schools are supposed to be a great option, because they release you from sort of some of the access barriers that you have in the traditional school models, depending on the state charter school law.
And depending on the schools themselves. You hit it. Right?
Yeah.
They have the capacity.
Right. Right, and can they? Because often there are still charter schools that have laws that are still, they're not released, and they're not given autonomy like they need to be, and they're not allowed to move and serve children right outside of their neighborhood in some cases. And so those issues do come up all over the place. And I would encourage you to attend Renita's session, because she's pretty brilliant in kind of articulating the enrollment diversity issues, ELL issues, and the legal sort of discussions around them as well.
One of the critiques that I hear a lot about charter schools is the impact that the charter schools have on public schools in general.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about, taxes and how much money is going into the public school system and how much is coming out of the charter schools, and that's often something that I hear on the street.
Right.
People just kind of say it without really knowing what they think.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit, about the impact of charters when they come into a school district, for instance? What is the impact really on the schools, the public school structure?
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit about, too, is there a difference in the impact depending on if it's a small charter versus one of these large charters like KIPP?
Right.
KIPP is huge. So it's hard to compare KIPP to a small charter school that's around the corner that's just beginning. So can you talk a little bit about, the tiers of charters, and then how those tiers have an impact on a district, and what happens to the non-charters in a district once the charters come in?
Yeah, sure.
Because that, I think, is something that people grapple with. Like, for instance, in Prince George's County, I think they're going to get their first charter soon, and it's a discussion that people are having. What's the impact going to be on the other schools there?
Right.
What is this going to do to the district in general? How it's, parents, community, that kind of
Huge, huge, huge question that we hear all over the place. Yesterday I was in a Senate hearing, and the senator didn't raise her hand to discuss anything that we were discussing about the bill component. She raised her hand and said, let's just back up, because I have issues with charter schools because I don't know how they impact. What about these other schools in our neighborhood, and what does that do to them? And so not only are they asking that on the high level, but parents ask that question like it's asked all over the place. And I would say that I don't necessarily know that I've looked at it as an impact being based on tiers on whether the school is small, but the impact is based on the school's results or lack thereof. And so and that's one way I would measure impact, or look at how impact is from charter to traditional. The other is, it's not necessarily the charter impacting the traditional so much as it is the perception, the strategies, the lack of collaboration or collaboration, the district's usage of charter schools. So if the district is not willing to engage charter schools at all, If the district is not willing to look at charter schools as an option to cross-pollinate best practices, innovative practices, and serve some populations that maybe traditional schools aren't serving, if the district is in that mode, you see a much different impact in the community than you do where you take someone like Tom Boasberg in Denver, where he's totally looking at how do charters fit into this large hybrid of options? How do we create this large vision with this large hybrid of options to serve every student? Nobody slips through the cracks because we just have so many different great things going on. How do we cross-pollinate between those schools? How do we strategize that? When you see that going on, you see great impact. You see a lot of schools working together, traditionals and charters, to implement best practices. I will say there are a lot of things that were off the table before charters ever stepped up on the scene. The best example, and I keep going back to Colorado because that's where I worked with Peter, but we had a charter school bill there. We have one of the strongest charter school bills in the law, and it was after this bill passed that we had the Innovative Schools Act bill that Peter sponsored. That bill allowed public traditional schools some of the same autonomies and got them through some of the same barriers that they had been trying to get through for many years. That conversation was never on the table about lengthening the school day, loosening up performance contracts, union contracts. Those discussions were not on the table. Like, they weren't even discussable. Like, you didn't even say those words until charter schools came and folks started paying attention to what small and big, KIPP and a small independent operator were able to do. And they said, well, wow, how did you do it? Well, it's actually not rocket science. Here are some of the things we did. We were able to do it simply because we had autonomy, because we had the flexibility, and we have the accountability to match it, and we're making gains. And a lot of traditional schools started looking at, well, how can we do some of those things? And so I've heard that from the school level, from principals. I've heard that on the legislative level. And I was even at a conference a couple years ago where Michelle Reed, you all know who she is, was in the room with with one of your superintendents here in Maryland, I think it was. No, it was Boston. And they were talking about how they were actually using charter schools to get what they needed in terms of change from their union contracts, because they were talking to union members and they were saying, you know, if you don't want to try it, if you don't want to do it, fine, we'll have charters do it. And I hate to say that that's what's happening, but it was able to allow them to get folks to start having conversations that they just would simply not have before. Not because they thought that the ideas were bad, but because it was all a political game. And so if you ask me about impact, I would say that those are the two areas where you look at impact. Are the schools in the area performing well? Because if they are, you often see that people want to try new things. They want to do more with charter schools. They want to cross-pollinate. And then also, is the district using it in that way, or are they kind of on guard and won't allow charters to open, and kind of the myths that are out there are being circulated and that sort of thing? You have a much different environment there than you do when you have people who are open and willing to just say, you know, it doesn't matter if you're charter, it doesn't matter if you're traditional. Are you effective? Do you work? Are you helping us move forward? So I kind of talked about some of these things, so I won't go too much into depth on this slide, but I just wanted to kind of go through some of the things we found in the work we were doing nationally around diversity. One, proper assessment being so important before you enter into a community, really understanding that community, understanding their needs, understanding their agenda, understanding how your policy impacts them, assessing the magnitude of change that you expect to see and their role in that, and really doing some homework before you go in. I've seen some folks that go into communities and step in front of a group and don't have that stuff in order and don't get what they need. And everybody really, you know, doesn't benefit from that. Intention, really looking at intention. I was in the Senate. I can think of two instances, both sides of the aisle, so this is not a party issue. A Republican says on the floor, it ended up in the paper the next day, you know, it doesn't really matter what sort of measures we pass, because at-risk kids, these kids are like, if you were a baker and you had bad flour and there were worms in the flour, you're just never going to get good bread out of that. Says that on the House floor. Republican. Other side, Senate, Democrat, says, you know, I was a teacher, they come into the classroom with all kinds of problems, and there's nothing you can really do with these kids. And so when you have those perceptions out there, they really do impact your ability to talk to those kids' parents. I have very low expectations for your kids. Can I open a charter school in your neighborhood? And so really looking at your intention, the intention of the folks who are asking for something of these communities, doing a benefits analysis. Okay, I get what you get out of it, but what do they get out of it? What are the opportunities there for them? Have you articulated that well? Have you messaged that well? That's not being done as much as it should be. The messenger, we had that conversation through a couple of slides, is so important, and the message is just as important. And having a strategic approach that kind of encompasses all those things. Time allotment for relationship building and other strategies is necessary. Really, a lot of folks are trying to get results like this, and there's a lot of pressure to get results like this. And that's great if it works, but a lot of times it's not sustainable. And so you really have to look at, if you want to not be staring your funders in the face in a year saying, I'm sorry I didn't get the results you need, but they didn't trust me and we couldn't work with our stakeholders because we didn't do stakeholder management, you'll end up in the same place anyway. And so really phasing, putting time in your plans and your strategies for building relationships and for strategizing work with these communities and targeting them on a micro level. Investing resources in all of that work is important. You can't, get blood out of a turnip. If you don't have what you need to actually do this work, the polling, the traveling, the messaging, the hiring, the mobilizing, the training, like those things cost money. They are towards a very targeted effort, and if that's not there, that investment is not there, not only will you not get what you need done, but you also will turn people off when you come to them and ask them to do a bunch of stuff, but you have nothing to put behind it to help them get there. Quality schools is so important, and closure advocacy is so important. Not faking like all charter schools work is so important, because those people are in neighborhoods where some of those schools are serving their children, and they know exactly what the numbers look like. And so keeping it real around the fact that some of those schools need to be closed, and you need a process for that, and that there are a lot of ways to increase quality in schools, and that needs to be pursued on a consistent basis, is really important. And then equity. Equity meaning, as I said earlier, you see so many of the resources being poured into the KIPs and the CMOs when 77% of your charter schools are small independent operators. Let's really look at really pouring resources in a more equitable manner into the entire movement in a way that impacts everyone that's involved, not the small few. And then having funders look at a more long-term vision, really looking at that kind of complete picture that I'm kind of talking about. And then finally, collaboration between all of the organizations is so important, because it will get in the way of things getting done when folks that are supposedly working together are working against each other. And so looking at collective impact, looking at strategizing who goes where when and who's targeting who is so effective, allows you to pool resources, it allows you to streamline your strategy and reach more people and make more gains. So those are some of the lessons that we got in the work that I was doing on the ground. And I thank you for having me, and I'm happy to engage in dialogue, Q&A, or whatever.
I have a question. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very well. I have a question about your equity statements up there, that 77% of the charters are small independents, but they're not getting the chunk of the money. They're getting the chunk of the resource. I mean, the other KIPs and all of those
CMOs.
The CMOs are basically getting. Why are they getting more of it? Are they just better funded from their funders, or are they lobbying and getting more money from the districts?
I think that's a chicken and egg question, but
Okay.
But I will say, and to some degree, when you say, are they lobbying, is that why they're getting money, or are they getting money because, so, but at the same time, a lot of people, not just in education, but funders want to fund something that they're, more closely going to be guaranteed results for. So they're more attracted to models that have proven success. They're more attracted to models that can be replicated. And so they're often more attracted to the franchise model, the CMO model, the EMO model, that they know they've seen work in other states, so that they know that there's an ROI.
Because those other models have done big evaluations, and they've got white papers that they printed up.
Right. And there's more of them, like there's 90 some, or there is now over 100 KIPs, right, in the country. And so they can see very clearly and the impact and the strategy. And you're right, they've designed and aligned systems and been very clear in articulating their strategies and their systems that work. And so it's very easy for a funder to understand what they're investing in, how it will turn out, and they have a greater chance of a good ROI. And so funders are, I think, more attracted to it for that purpose. The same thing on the federal level, like replication dollars are really about, we don't have a lot of time. We want to know what works, and if it works, let's just, fund it. But it is overlooking the fact that, okay, great, you're funding about 12% of the movement. How far does that get you? You still have 77% out there that are still left with dealing with quality growth and sustainability.
What's your sense for groups like the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, those groups? What is their main problem with aligning themselves with? What is the underlying issue you think there when it comes to issues of race and equity, historical kinds of issues? What's going on?
Yeah, and I'm on tape, aren't I?
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, okay, so we'll start on the light end and then move into the heavy end. I think when they often don't understand the issue fully. The issue is still an issue that a lot of people don't understand. It's evolving, so it's changing constantly, daily, what it looks like, how it works, and what's effective, what's new. And so they often, when you talk to them, they're not even aware of exactly what the facts are. So starting there, that's like the first thing. And then once you kind of get them past, okay, I get it now. I know what a charter school is. I know what they do. I know what the effective ones do and how they work. Then you have to move into sort of the mobilization and support mode. And getting them to support is often political. Like they want to look at what other groups are doing, that their allies are doing. They want to look at what their funders are supporting. Often they get union support as well, and people don't talk about that. They want to look at what their community leaders are saying and just what the perception out there is. And they often want to jump on a bandwagon before they even do their homework. And even sometimes once they do their homework, there's just no political will to move forward and do something different. I would say that those are the biggest struggles that I've had, in talking to civil rights leaders about where they stand on the issue. I'm often encouraging folks to just okay, I can respect if you don't think it's great policy, if you don't think it works, if it's not right for your community, I can respect that. But to just not vote for something because someone is paying you or you have support resources coming from this venue or because you feel like your friends are, I had a legislator tell me yesterday, I'm going to vote against this because I voted against it the last time. And I promise you, this is what was said. I don't really care about the failing schools in other areas in the state because my district is fine. And I rarely get speechless, and I was like, alrighty then, well, there's nothing left to talk about. And you get that perspective a lot when you're out talking to folks around charter schools. And even when they do really want to support it, sometimes it's just hard. There's so much pressure to do the opposite, and there's so much on the line and other things that they're trying to do. Like I said earlier with legislators, that same thing with civil rights leaders. They're often feeling like if I do this, then I can't work with this person on this issue.
Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up to that. I'm not sure how much of it is a question and how much is a comment. But as a question, I guess it's how would you go about convincing those people that charters are the answer to the problems that they're looking at? And I guess what I'm getting at is some of these same issues that you talked about with equity, and this may be perception and it may be partly reality, and I suspect it differs very much state to state and on the specifics of the charter law and the specifics of the funding formula. But what I hear a lot of those people saying is charters seem to work great, but it's not a system that could work. If 100% of the schools converted to charters, it wouldn't work. So it means that some schools are getting privileges that others don't, and some group is getting left behind. How do you respond to that kind of argument in arguing for charter schools as a way to help historically disadvantaged populations in schools?
Right. So you want me to answer that as Makisha, the person who works for DPS and worked for the Alliance, or you want me to answer that as Makisha, who has an 11-year-old who had a very hard time accessing the traditional school system in Denver Public Schools? Because the reality is that traditional schools have major access problems. So for them to talk about access to charter schools is a joke. It's a joke. And I've said that to folks before. I've sat around a table with a legislator who had a group of parents with her. And I said, how many of you, because there are no charter schools here because your law is horrible, and so you have no charter schools, so we're dealing with traditional schools. How many of you know what like the top 5 schools are in your area? All raise your hand. How many of you could get your kids into them? So the access issue is across the board, regardless of whether a school is traditional or charter. You see a lot more access to charter schools than you do traditional schools for students who can't access these traditional magnet schools and other types of gifted schools and other programs that are really competitive. And they actually have laws behind them to help with that. So folks hate the lottery, but my son actually said to me after watching Waiting for Superman one time, he said, Mom, I don't like the lottery because it's so sad and people don't get in, and some people get in and other people don't. And I said, actually, that happens regardless of whether there's a lottery or not. The difference with the lottery is that now there's a system so that the people who get in a fair way. You just kind of toss it up. The sad part is that there's just not enough seats, quality seats, where everybody can get that type of education, and that's going to take time. And people often want to focus on charter schools and access, and it's just, I have a hard time as a parent who really struggled to find the right school for my son in a traditional setting. With looking at charters and access. Their laws around charter access and enrollment are much more fair compared to traditional schools.
No, I wouldn't argue that point. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. But what's step 2 then to improve the schools that don't, either the charters that don't work or the traditional public schools that, aren't the top 5 in the district? How can the charter movement contribute to that?
To the access or to the quality?
To the quality.
Oh, gosh. Well, charters contribute to quality, in my opinion, often because they are implementing best practices using autonomy and flexibility that traditional schools don't have, showing folks that things that we've been saying work for years, but they haven't had the political flexibility to do. They're showing folks that now, I did it, nobody died, the sky didn't fall down, I lengthened my school day, the kids are still okay, everybody's good, you can do it too across the street. And so you see that kind of impact on quality. In terms of, you asked me, what do I say in terms of telling people that charters are the answer? I never say charters are the answer. Charters are one component. There's so much other work to do. We passed the teacher effectiveness bill in the Senate that was very, very difficult. That had a major impact on traditional and charter schools in terms of the work that it did for the community, where there were a lot of displaced teachers, a lot of management and hiring problems. And so there's just so many things you can do in ed reform, have to do in ed reform to move the ball forward. And charters are just one component, and I often start off by saying that. Like, I have no loyalties to charter schools. I have loyalty to effective policy and effective schools that work for kids. And we really should be approaching the conversation from that standpoint, but it's often not happening because folks are too laser focused on hating or loving charters.
I think my question is just a little different way of asking some of the things that you already responded to, but do you ever get any pushback at any level when people say, well, what happens to the schools that these students leave and come to? I think it's a little different way of asking the same thing, but you take your children out. What that has an effect on the school where they left. And does that argument ever enter in at any level? Do you hear it a lot from any particular constituencies? And then, of course, how do you address it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you do hear that a lot. And I often get like I got with the question about access to traditional schools versus charter schools. As a parent, I'm like, so you think that I should leave my child in this school where my child is not learning, he's not going to graduate, he's not going to go to college, he's going to slip through the cracks, but you think that we should keep him there because the school will stay alive? No. I think that he needs to go where results are, and we need to support the schools where there are results. We need to close the schools where there aren't results, or reform and turn them around, which is very difficult to do for a number of reasons. But I don't think we should support schools that don't work. And I don't think our loyalties are to institutions or schools or types of schools. I think our loyalties are to kids and results. That's just my personal spiel.
I have a question about for parents. I think that there are so many families that can really benefit from alternative choices. How do you better educate parents about what choices are out there? I mean, put up a website or something like, I mean, that's kind
Totally.
of not really getting to it, though.
Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't talk more about that, because that was a large part of my work, working with parents and community members, training and mobilizing them, educating them on the system, because I believe that they are the ones with the right picture. They have this kid in front of them. They really don't care what the state law looks like. All they know is that this kid needs to succeed. And so everything they do revolves around that focus, which is why parents are so important as being the heart of this movement. And so in terms of training them, I found that on the ground, a lot of them don't know the difference. Like, they don't know charter versus traditional. They don't know, but what's most frustrating for me is that they don't know what the people who represent them are doing on their behalf or not doing on their behalf. And so we went in and we trained in Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, and Kentucky. We did training sessions on what charter schools are. So we started with sort of public education, and then we moved into the mobilization piece when folks are like, and it doesn't take much. A parent, you just give them sort of like 4 major facts, and they're like, so you're telling me this, and this, and this, and this, and all I have to do is this, and that changes this? And you're like, yes. And then all of a sudden you have support. And so what we did is often we listened a lot to them, because they could tell us more about their local systems in ways that helped us build support to change the laws. And we helped them cultivate their story. We did storytelling workshops for legislative advocacy, so that parents would know how to go to the Capitol and fight for what they want. And they often felt like, I heard so much, one of the biggest barriers is, I don't know the policy, I don't know the law, and I'm like, and that's not your power, quite frankly. Like, lobbyists go to legislators all the time with fact sheets. What you have is the real story about your child, about Brenda, about Shaniqua, about Raheem, and your legislator needs to hear how the votes they make impact them. And so what you need to do is work on cultivating your story and understanding how their policy impacts your story. And so we're going to work with you on that. And so that was the work we did in the southern states. But it was often that they didn't know their power, and they thought that they needed to focus their efforts on things that really weren't their strengths and weren't really going to move the ball legislatively anyway.
So did you have different degrees of difficulty getting to work with parents?
Oh, yes. They're definitely tiered.
Yeah.
Like, you have parents who just don't care. I'm just being honest. Don't care about the issues, or maybe not even about their kids' success. You have parents who care and work really hard to try to figure it out, but they just don't have the tools and the information that they need to advocate on the school level or on the legislative level. And then you have...
At the school level, I mean, about at the public school level, I mean, is there a lot of animosity there for you coming in and trying to work with parents?
Oh, I didn't go through the schools. So if they were upset, it wasn't because I was like waiting outside after school for the parents or anything.
I guess my thought, though, is that if you don't get into the schools to present your message, I mean, parents may never even learn it.
Right, right. And so I guess what I'm saying is I didn't use...
Stakeholders?
What's that?
Did you go through some of the other stakeholders?
Right, to get to those parents that for their schools. So yeah, but that is hard. I mean, it's difficult to reach the parents. That's always the question. Like, how do you reach the parents? And when you reach them, how do you categorize them appropriately so that you get them what they need, so that you can mobilize them? Because not all parents need the same thing. And then that's not even just based on their education level, but their time availability, their interest in the matter. And there's tons of different things parents can do to support these types of efforts, but you just have to be strategic about really assessing how to reach them and how to mobilize them. But it's hard. It's definitely one of the hardest things, but I think the most rewarding things for me in the work that I've done is seeing parents who came in not even knowing what a charter school was, not understanding anything about the legislative process, leaving their state and knowing that they were at the Capitol letting legislators have it about what they see, what they know, and what they will tolerate and not tolerate, and you're representing me, and I'm going to use my vote and use my power to make a change in the system as a parent. That's where more work needs to be done.
You know, it's just such a problem because I've got a friend, and she's looking at a list of 14, and I live in the District of Columbia, she's looking at a list of 14 middle schools that are charter schools, and she gets to pick one. You know, how do you do it?
Right.
Is there one of these?
Oh, and that's the school selection choice. Oh my gosh. Peter's wife and I are good friends, and we did in first grade, when our kids were going to first grade, we did our school search together. And we both had these 2 big binders. And she found like the top 10 schools, and I found another top 10 schools, and we did all this stuff, and we actually made the copies and created identical binders, and we set up appointments, and we went to the different schools. A lot of parents can't do that. They don't know to do that, and they don't have the resources. And so organizations like Picky Parents and Black Alliance for Educational Options are supposed to help with that sort of thing, but they're just not getting down there in the trenches enough to where it's making a wide enough impact. Well, thank you.
I just whispered social capital is really having the social capital, the know-how, the knowledge, the relationships, to know how to even judge schools.
Absolutely.
And to understand that your child is missing something.
Right.
Sometimes parents don't get, they think this is all there is. They don't
Right.
actually even realize that there's something more that my child might need.
Right.
And so, you know, in many ways, we're trying to fix a system that's a social order, so to
Yes.
speak.
Absolutely.
Which is really what we're trying to do, to create options for people that really can't see the options normally, that really are blind to that whole process.
Right.
And, you know, it's really, when I asked you the question about what do you think is going on with the groups like CBC, it's always, I find in my just talking to teachers sometimes about charter schools or vouchers, school choice in general, more experienced teachers that have been in really difficult, challenging schools, they often think of charters like it's a threat to them.
Right.
Their school, a threat to their job in some way, too.
Right.
And I think that when you, large numbers, particularly in urban inner city schools where you have large numbers of African American teachers that have been there for years, and their jobs feel threatened, there's a pushback, and then they, you know, those are your most likely voters too. So
Right.
you have your CBC members who are coming from those districts.
Huge,
which
huge
creates
point.
this cycle of maintaining some of the status quo there.
Huge
So
point.
I was thinking fear, you know, I was thinking, could it be fear going even back to those districts of people feeling threatened by what this could mean for them and their jobs? It's change. I mean,
Right.
Changing the system.
Right. That's huge, and I
It's
think that
really-
was like,
It's huge, and it's systemic.
especially with, like, you look at like the African American and Hispanic community, and you look at teachers in the historical sort of, there's like a respect, there's like a social order there where teachers were often viewed as the leaders of the community, particularly through slavery and forward, and that has spilled over a little bit. And so when you have this school that threatens your teachers' jobs and you look at them in that way, it really does change your ability to build support. And again, I do believe that a lot of it stems from messaging from opposition. Because if you really stop and think about, you know, what the benefits are for a teacher, I mean, again, there's 2 sets of options. It really depends on the type of teacher you are, on which system you're in, what you're looking for out of your career, and that sort of thing. And so a lot of charter teachers are very happy in the work that they do. And there are a lot of types of teachers that are just much better set up for, or geared for, or appropriate for a charter career. And so it really is something where it's often across the board, not just this group, but across the board. I have to try to assess and encourage the person that I'm talking to really tell me where their ideas are coming from, where their mindset is coming from. Because if it's starting with something somebody else told you, a perception that you got from somewhere else, a system that's been in place forever, let's scrap all that, because we're not talking about the same stuff. This is a little bit different, and start from scratch. And if you still don't like it after that, then great. But, you know, But yeah, the teacher thing, the teacher piece is really important. The jobs piece is really important, and something that mainstream, I'm surprised I didn't say that either. I thought I had it on my map. Funders, mainstream organizers will have to address that if they want to, in terms of their benefits analysis, if they want to, and in building that diverse pipeline of leadership, if they want to draw support from communities of color, they have to show those community leaders that they have a place in that system. So, is that all?
I think so.
Okay. Thank you so much.